During this time of celebration, reflect upon the importance and depth of the faith. There is this tendency to separate from religion, this meaning that there is a sense of participation, but only as the faith's methodology allows. The role of participant is that of a sideline observer. To live the faith is a different task altogether. Reading about farmers and gardeners, and maybe studying the philosophy and science of horticulture, it has its limits. But to actually give into the act of gardening, to apply the knowledge, to make the practice tangible and to live it, to get the hands dirty, this is a completely different experience, a different learning opportunity. It provides the depth of the words. As we celebrate the joyous resurrection in the celebration of Easter, it's important to understand that the Christian faith is a preparation for life and death into eternal life, that there is life in death. It is also a call for individual death to sin, to let the habits and routines that create distance from God and the doctrine of Christ, to let these pass away within this life on earth, that there is life, glorified life in this. This is hand in hand with the path to eternal life, but it is realized in this lifetime that Christ's teaching be reflected in every action, a living and active faith, to convert the souls of others with actions, to live by example, but not for the sake of example, to be Christian, to be Christ-like. While words have their place, the saint speaks volumes through the simplest of actions. And so look at the gardening analogy again. There is this perspective of resistance, seeing the labors as unpleasant, seeing the work in the garden bed as less than ideal. But if we consider Christ and his message on earth, his suffering and death for humanity out of love, his resurrection and victory over death, consider these things. Because when the reality of God's love penetrates the soul, the perspective naturally shifts. It becomes a labor of love to cultivate the crops of God's qualities, that these crops be harvested in abundance, that they may be shared with all, that the entire practice be seen for its selflessness as a reflection of the selflessness and mercy and love that God has shown for all people through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. When the process is resisted, the self-will is not in line with God's will. There is an obvious discord within, an emptiness and an incompleteness, a continued searching for something to fill that space, the space that God inhabits, but whose presence is thus denied. When we see that analogy as something that we resist, as the process being resisted, that is like keeping religion on the surface as a bystander, feeling it as repressive rather than being involved in it. To further exemplify this, let's look to the wisdom of the book of The Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle. In the light of the moon, a little egg lay on a leaf, and so one morning a little caterpillar hatches from this egg. He is described as a very hungry caterpillar, and each day he eats a little bit more. On the first day he eats 1 apple, the second day 2 pears, the third day 3 plums, and so on. In spite of all of this, with the conclusion of each day, he was still hungry. So at the week's end, the caterpillar had eaten more and more, until eventually he indulges in this eating spree, perhaps beyond the needs of such a tiny creature, where he eats through 1 piece of chocolate cake, 1 ice cream cone, 1 pickle, 1 slice of Swiss cheese, 1 slice of salami, 1 lollipop, 1 piece of cherry pie, 1 sausage, 1 cupcake, and 1 slice of watermelon. And that night, the caterpillar had a stomachache. The next day, he takes a bite of a nice green leaf. Now, not only was he no longer hungry, but he was no longer a little caterpillar. So he built his cocoon, stays inside for 2 weeks, and thus becomes a beautiful butterfly. Well, and then he becomes a beautiful butterfly. The egg is this pure white circle on the nice green leaf. But as time goes on, the caterpillar's hunger takes him from where he started on this journey of indulgence, every day eating something new, every day eating more than the day before, more and more, and yet the caterpillar is still hungry. He's constantly described as hungry as he goes on and on. As a culture, but more importantly as individuals, perhaps this resonates. Born into the world from God's love and with God's purity, the experiences and conditions of development have their influences, and so does the course of our lives. However, the story can often parallel this, for as time goes on, like the little caterpillar, that hunger for more, it drives the car down the road of worldliness. This is manifested differently for everyone. But as long as there is a passenger in the car of desire, journeying down the path of pleasures, the further it seems to take away from that pure green leaf where the story began, the more distance seems to grow between the 2 points, from where we are and from where we came. The more that this quest for instant gratification and pleasure and desire take priority in life, the more attachment and selfish qualities supersede the qualities of selflessness, the further from God's qualities we seem to be. This is not to paint an unobtainable perfection, but to acknowledge the refocusing of priorities and the necessity that has in living in accordance with Christ's doctrine. As the journey of pleasure-seeking leads further from the origin of the story, the caterpillar is left with a stomachache, a sense of dissatisfaction, or being internally unsettled. Because all beings are spiritual beings on a spiritual path, and so God's qualities are innately known, when temptation or pleasure or pride lead us astray, a selfishness is overgrown in that garden within us. And we have this unquenchable sense of dissatisfaction, this unquenchable hunger, this constant desire to fill that void. And it is constantly in this internal unsettled state that is briefly satisfied, but never with a longer lasting fulfillment. Sometimes this increases this cycle of jumping from one thing to another. However, eventually, like the caterpillar, returning to that green leaf, there's this moment of humility and clarity, a moment of returning to the simplicity and purity which the story began, to what we have already deeply known inside. The cocoon is a solitary time. It's a time for self-reflection, a time of fasting, where the caterpillar undergoes this dramatic and intense changing to become this beautiful butterfly. Examine the faith and the relationship and the role it plays on an individual level. Does it inspire the promptings for internal and thus external change? This is necessary for the death of sin and the resurrection of the Christian faith within as individuals. That's Christ's doctrine. It may be victorious over the temptations of the world. Again, this is not to set an unobtainable goal, but in living for eternity, there is this idea of living a life as set by the commandments, to see Christ's example and to live according to his doctrine, that his death be seen as such an immeasurable act of love that it moves us towards wanting to live this life that would be pleasing to God. This is how grace acts upon. And it's part of this Easter promise to seek to overcome sin and temptation on earth, that God's love may shine through. As Pope Francis mentioned in his Easter Vigil homily, that the stones that block our hearts be rolled away, that we let this process occur, that we cooperate in the resurrection of our faith, the resurrection of God's qualities within us, that we may shine them to all people. This is a process, but this is a purpose of life on earth, that God so loved the world that he sent his only Son to die for the sins of all, that this should be so moving, so profound, and so transformative that it turns to introspection on the priorities of the gift and purpose of life, that the message of Christ be reflected in even the most simple actions and gestures, that we may learn to love one another as God truly loves everyone. Wishing you a joyous and peace-filled Easter season. As always, thank you for listening.